Okay, chapter 3, curves. We're going to talk about how to make curves, how to make your guide curves, how to not make your guide curves, best practices. Yeah, so everything that we do, of course, starts with a nice clean curve. If you want to make a nice clean surface, typically you got to start with a nice clean curve, right? So that's why we're going all the way back to something very basic. For some folks, this might be review. For others, there might be some new ways of thinking about curves and new workflows in this. So anyway, let's get started and let's talk about curves. So funny enough, one of the best resources that I found in terms of talking about curves and how to make good, clean guide curves, and I'm going to leave a link to this in the description. There's an Alias website here called Alias Golden Rules. And in general, I really like a lot of the content on these pages here. This is some good stuff. So these are all worth looking at. I don't 100% like all of it, but I at least 90% like or 95% like what's on here. So we're just going to go through these because I would just be making the same content really. So on number 1, they say create a good flow of CVs. I would say you could think of that as your point distribution, right? And was probably a better word than flow. And they go through some examples of bad CV layout, right, or point layout, and good point layout. And these are totally right on. I like these a lot. There's typically things get weird when your verts get crossed up like this. Usually you're going to have less than ideal curves, less than ideal surfaces. You want even spacing. Like if you look at this here on the left versus this here on the right, you can see that this curve, the curvature increases as you go from left to right, and the point distribution gets closer and closer. That's great. That's really good layout. And they do say on here, a lot of this is kind of done by eye, right? So this is kind of like, does this curve feel right to me? If I bring up curvature graph, does my curvature graph kind of reflect what I think this curve should be doing, right? And they give this car example here. And this is one of the things, like, I like this. I think if you're just like tracing a sketch, right? And we'll get into, see what they're doing here is they're starting with it as degree 2, right? Single span, and then degree 3, and degree 4, and degree 5. And each time they're able to make this little curve here a little tighter, get a little more control over this guide curve, right? The thing about this is, like, if you're making a conceptual model, I think that this is totally fine. But if you're actually doing production surfacing, I think a lot of times what you may end up doing is creating a curve that's your roof and a curve that's your windshield, and then creating a blend between the two of them, because so ultimately that's going to allow you the most control. But this, of course, is very, very smooth, and a lot of that comes down to like a judgment call on your individual model, right? But basically the gist of this whole page is that your distribution, your layout of your verts should be reflective of the geometry that you want to make, right? And should be sensical, right? It shouldn't look like it's taken the trip to crazy land like it does in some of these examples here. The next two rules, well, the next rule, use the minimum number of CVs, is really redundant if you skip to rule number 3. Rule number 3 is use single span for smooth curves. Well, yeah, if you're using a single span curve, then you are by definition using the minimum number of control points. So all of this can really be boiled down into your guide curves should really always be a single span curve. And the distribution of your points should reflect the geometry that you're trying to represent. Okay, so back to Rhino. To recap and look forward, this is how I see it. You should use single span curves for your guide curves, period. Full stop. If you are in a situation where you can't get a single span, say degree 5 curve, to represent your geometry, especially on a conceptual model. There's different things when you're, say, reverse engineering from laser scan and whatnot, but on a conceptual model, if you can't get a single span degree 5 curve to describe your geometry, what you're going for, you need to take a step back and ask yourself why that is, right? And a lot of that might have to do with how you're laying out your curves, like sort of where you're setting your curve endpoints. So we're going to talk after this about curve layout. So you should it should always be setting alarm bells off if you're like, I've got this guide curve and it has 10 points and it's degree 3 and it's the only thing that will do it. You should start to think long and hard about why that is, right? That's a reality check right there. So number 2, the design intent or the complexity of the shape that you're going after, that's what determines your degree, right? So, something that just has a smooth arc to it can oftentimes just be represented by a degree 2 or a degree 3 curve, no problem. If you have something that has more complexity to it, then a degree 5 curve might be warranted, right? Degree 4, degree 5. And the point distribution, the point layout on those curves, should follow some sort of logic. Again, a lot of that's done by eye and feel and some experience. But you should be able to look at your points and be like, yeah, there's a logic to that. That's doing something that I think it should, right? And then sort of looking forward, and we're going to talk about this now, the next module is going to be on patch layout. And what I realized is that to talk about patch layout, really first we have to talk about curve layout and how do we lay out our curves on our geometry when we're creating these guide curves, because a lot of times your guide curves are going to determine your where your guide curves start and end, have a huge impact, of course, on your patch layout. So when you're setting up your guide curves, you should already be thinking about your patch layout and how your guide curves are going to affect your patch layout, whether or not your guide curves allow the patch layout that you think you need to solve the problem that you're trying to solve, right? So there's a big part of this where you got to understand and you got to start thinking when you're making your curves about this curve, this is going to probably be a surface edge. So what does that mean, right? Is this where I want it to be? Is this as smooth as I want it to be? Does this capture the shape that I want, right? So these are the sort of the 5 points that I really want to make with this particular module. All right, so to give some examples on this, one thing I did, I sort of went back to the beginning for me, which was tracing airplanes on 3 views from the web, right? A lot of my background is in aviation, and this is kind of where I started with things. And this is also the sort of thing that I see a lot on the Rhino forum, on the discussion, where people are saying I'm trying to model this airplane and I'm not sure what I'm doing, right? I see that a lot. And so I thought I'd use this Spitfire here as an example and show some different workflows and some things to look out for. And so what I thought I would do is I would start doing it the way that I started, and I can show you the wrong way to do it, which is, there's a lot of these curves here. So we're going to trace some of these curves on the wing, right? And what a lot of people use is they use the interp curve command, right? So you want to interpolate points, and they pick along, the drawing and to sort of describe their curve, right? So let me show you what that looks like and why you shouldn't do it, right? So I'm going for the plan form, which is like the top view or the bottom view of this wing right now. We're going to describe that. And it looks like we've got this nice sort of evenly curving trailing edge, right? And I would say like all of this here looks to me to be like sort of one curve, and then the tip here is kind of separate, right? You can view these things, and this gets to curve layout, right? You know, one way that you can think about curve layout is, you know, we've got we've got an accelerating curvature here, but it's not totally crazy, right? And so you can think of this, you know, don't try to make this whole outline as one single curve ever, right? We want to break these down, like I said in numbers 4 and 5, and we want to break these down into elements, right? Sort of the design intent of this. And so you can see we've got this sort of smoothly flowing curve here, but then it gets really sharp here at the tip, right? Well, the tip should be a separate curve. You shouldn't be combining, say, this part of this curve here with this here, and you certainly shouldn't be wrapping them all the way around, right? But let me show you first, you know, where interp curve goes off the rails and why interp curve shouldn't be used. So, you know, I'm just going to say, I'm going to start picking points here and go along here, and I'm making my trailing edge here for my wing. It's looking pretty good, right? You know, like, doesn't look bad, like, looks pretty nice. And we're going to pick points a little bit closer together now because we're getting to where it's got a little more curvature, you see. So let's do this, and let's do this, and let's call that the end of the curve, right? Let's see what that looks like. And, you know, this did what we told it to do, right? But let's turn our points on. We have, let's see here, 10 points. That's kind of a lot, right? We're not really describing the most complicated thing here, and we've got 10 points to do it. Now let's look at our curvature. Let's see what that looks like. Let's look at curvature graph on this. That's really ugly, right? You know, this is not even internally continuous. It's not even internally smooth, right? And so this is why we want to be using single span guide curves. This is pretty garbagey, right? And we can edit it, sure, but you know, at this point we're kind of smoothing things over that have already gone off the rails. And you'll see even when we edit it, we still have these internal, you know, kinks because this curve is over-defined. It is not single span. It has too many points to be single span. And when you do this, this is the result, right? So you may want to use this as the basis of something to rebuild. That is certainly one way to do it. That's sort of like your standard stock answer is like, well, you take this and you rebuild it, right? I'm going to show you a totally different workflow, a different way of approaching this. I'm going to turn this on. The other thing to realize too is like there is some sort of a straight line here, right? Like there's definitely a orthographic line along here. And so what I like to do is just kind of draw an orthographic line and see where it diverges from the trace. And it really looks to me like there's our, right, that's where we should start our line. Like this is a straight line and this is where our curve starts. And this is another thing that I see over and over and over again is people trying to combine straight curves with curves that are not straight, right? In some sort of way, shape, or form, they kind of cram those two things into one curve, and that is never, ever, ever the right way to do it. If you have a straight line, it should be represented by a line with 2 points, the start and a finish. That is it. There should be no control points. It should be degree 1, right? You should have a degree 1 curve to represent the straight lines in your model. Always. Period. Full stop. Always. Right. So, but let me show you how I would actually trace this back end here. I'm going to just start with a straight line. I'm going to start right here where I think that this thing starts to curve, right? And I'm going to draw a straight line to about right here. Sort of where I think this tip maybe starts to become the wing tip, right? And what I'm going to do now, let me just get rid of this. So I have a straight line. That goes to the start and the finish. Pretty simple. Then I go to change degree, and I'm going to up this to degree 2. And I'm going to turn on my points. And I'm going to grab this control point. And now remember, like, we've got sort of lower curvature here, and it seems to curve a little more here. So I'm going to take this point, and I'm going to kind of move it over here like this. And holy smokes, are we already looking pretty darn good. We're not great, like we're not 100% there yet, but we're kind of getting there already, right? So now I've gone from degree 1 to degree 2. I know that my shape is a little more complicated, so I run change degree again. And now I say degree 3, and then I use this degree 3 curve, right? I'm going to move this a little bit this way, maybe move it a little bit this way, right? I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to sweep up and down my curve, and I'm going to point edit it, right? And I think we need a little more. We need a little more control still, right? So I'm going to go to like degree 4. It looks to me like we need to come a little bit this way here, right? Maybe now we need to come a little bit this way here. Okay, nice, nice. And I feel like, see here, like we're kind of missing the tangent here. We're also not exactly where we want to be here. We can move that. But yeah, you can see like we're not really we're kind of cutting on the inside here. And so I would change degree one more time up to like degree 5. And I would use this one to come down here and really kind of hit that acceleration, right? Where it starts to accelerate here. And then you can sit here and do this. Yep, that looks great. This can now come out this way a little bit, right? And the other thing to recognize about this is realize, like, we are applying design tools that were not available when this thing was designed, right? People, people go and make models of these things, and I think they think that the original was maybe a lot smoother than it was. In reality, these things, a lot of these things were pretty crude. If you go to an aircraft museum, you look at these things up close, they look like they've been banged with hammers a lot of the time. Of course, a lot of that's because they went through battle and whatnot. But a lot of these things are way more crudely built than people realize. There's a lot of stuff with lap seams and all that on the actual thing is not even G0 at the end of the day, right? But of course, what we're trying to do is kind of distill the idea, the essence, the design intent into a NURBS model. So, but just, yeah, try not to overthink these things in terms of tracing them is always my advice, right? So yeah, so now, let's look at our curvature graph here again. See what this looks like. Well, look at that. It's got a really nice flow to it, right? It accelerates as we go to the outside here. We might look at this and we might say like this should stay constant or sort of taper off. So we might even look at this and be like, well, if we just move this a tiny bit, then our curvature makes even more sense, right? So this is editable. This is smooth, right? We can guide and we can match to this. Like, we can use this as input geometry, and it's not going to come back to bite us. This is what we want. We don't want that whole interp curve mess. And the last thing I want to add is how much of a frontline tool curvature graph should be when you're making guide curves, right? So, and it kind of goes hand in hand with that your point distribution should make sense. If your point distribution makes sense, then your curvature graph is going to make sense, right? But oftentimes the curvature graph is where you can see if there's little problems in your distribution or in the way your verts are inflected, right? And so curvature graph should always, always, always be used on every single guide curve that you make. All right, so I was in a discussion on the Rhino forum with a user about generating guide curves, and he was saying he uses curve from 2 views to generate guide curves, and I thought that would actually dovetail nicely into this module, talk about why maybe that's not a good thing. So, curve two views takes two planar curves and sort of creates the intersection of them, right? And so what I have here is I have two single span degree 3 curves that are both planar. And so let me show you when I use curve two view what we get. So we just feed in our two curves, and this looks, this does the thing that you're asking it to do, right? It matches both of those views, right? It's curve in two views. And this is the first thing that you should do on any curve that you create as a guide curve. F10, turn your points on. Look at this. We've gone from, having 4 points each on these to having 16 points, right? I'm pretty sure we don't need 16 points to describe this, right? And again, we bring up curvature graph. And we can see that it's not terrible, but you can see that it's still internally not smooth, right? So you're still getting these kinks in curvature here. And so, as a guide curve, this is just not what you want, right? This is not your friend here. And so the simplest answer to this, like to what to do, is simply to rebuild it, right? Just rebuild. 6 points, degree 5, gives us a maximum deviation of 5 thou, which is very small, right? Cool. So let's go with that. So we've changed our curve all of 5 thou. It is now a single span degree 5 curve. And we bring a curvature graph. And look at that. Like, that's what we want, right? That's a guide curve. We can match things to that. We know it's going to work out well, right? So every single guide curve that you make, you should be turning on the points. You should be looking at those points. You should be turning on curvature graph. You should be looking at it, and you should be thinking about, is this curve over-described? Is it doing what I want it to do? Can I describe the same shape with fewer points, with a lower degree, right? So that is why you never really, you never want to directly use the result of something like curve two view. Same way that you don't want to use interp curve, the direct result of that, all right? Okay, so back to the Spitfire. If we now want to trace the leading edge, the first thing that really catches my eye here is that this really looks to be a straight line to me, right? This inboard section of the leading edge looks pretty darn straight, right? In all these, it looks like there's this flat here, whereas in the back, it's already curving. So I'm going to, of course, represent that by a straight line, right? And let's just do this and extend it extra. So, yeah, somewhere around in here, I think it stops. So let's just leave it there, right? So, going back to what we already talked about in terms of curve layout, driving patch layout, if this leading edge here of this wing is straight, right, and the back here is curved, I already know that my patch layout of my wing for all my wing surfaces, right, it's going to have a break right here. There's going to be an inboard section to this wing, and there's going to be an outboard section to this wing. Because that way, I can have control over both of these sections. The worst thing to do would be to try to represent these two design ideas by one single surface. It's not the way to do it. Because if you want this straight leading edge, and then you want this to be curved, it's two different ideas. That's what the design intent dictates, right? So now let's go and let's make the outboard curving part. And I'm going to keep the end of it sort of even with the end of the back, right? And so all I'm going to do is go and make a straight line again. I'm going to do the same workflow that I did before. Run change degree on this, F10, change degree. This is now degree 2. I grab my point, right? I bring it down, I bring it out. I start editing this, right? And let's do this one more time, a little bit like that. And I change degree again on this. And we say now 3, right? And we bring this up, and this is just exactly like we did on the trailing edge, right? And of course, one thing we'll probably want to do here is we'll want to make sure that this line ends up being tangent to that line, right? Those two, we want those to be tangent. Of course, in reality, the way that this thing is built, as I said before, like these things are really crude. So we're going to make this tangent, but we'll see, right? Let's change degree again. Let's make this degree 4. Awesome. And I think that's about all we need to describe this curve personally, right? That's pretty good. That's pretty good right there, right? We can run our match command, not match surf, but just match. We can pick this curve. We're going to match it to this one, and we're going to say by tangency, right? And see what happens. I still like it. Still decent, right? So again, now if we go and we look at our curvature graph, right? There you go. That's what we want. It's just smoothly accelerating our curvature as we go towards the tip. That's it, right? And then we can finish off by just making, say, a blend out of these, right? I'm going to use my fancy VSR tool here because I like it. I like the interface a lot, but you can use Rhino's blend curve as well. Let's adjust scale here. Let's see what happens if we say curve. Right. I mean, come on. It's like, this is almost too easy. So here's a cool trick, right? Let's say, so we've set this to curvature here, right? But let's say we're willing to accept tangency here, right? Again, a crudely made thing. This does not, there's nothing about this original that is G2 curvature continuous. What we can do, so this is close, right? But I see how like right here, like at this vert here, like I feel like it could come out a little more. Well, cool. So what we can do is we can turn on our points. Now, if all I care about is tangency, right? The tangency is set by this vert to this backline here. So I know that I am free to move this vert however I see fit without affecting the tangency here. Same thing with this vert here. If all I care about is tangency up front here, I can move this vert all day long and my tangency here is identical, right? So let's, we can sit here and do something like this, right? We can run our curvature graph. We can maybe say like, oh, well now it's kind of a little, maybe like that. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of all you need to do. It's not super complicated, right? And we know that we're free to move these two verts however we want. We can sculpt this thing. We can move it around. And if we look at our curvature graph on this, let's turn this off. Let's bring this scale down. Yeah, that's what you'd think the curvature graph would be on this, right? Nice and smooth, accelerating, decelerating towards the tips. That's what you want. It's a nice, valid guide curve, right? So that covers curves. All of this stuff is going to get bumped up into 3 dimensions in the next video when we talk about patch layout. But all the fundamentals, like really the next video is just taking a lot of these fundamentals and just bumping them up into 3-dimensional surfaces rather than these guide curves, right? So have a really good sense for single span and how to make single span and different workflows. I showed you that, you don't just, you can rebuild, sure, like that's one way to do it. And then the other way is to do this, sort of start with a straight line and use this change degree and sculpt workflow, right? You should know, you should have a good sense now of like, what's a good looking guide curve and what isn't a good looking guide curve, all right? So I hope you got a lot out of that, and I'll see you in episode 4.